All right, so let's talk about the civil case that Trump's involved with now and the finding of fraud by a New York State judge. Okay, so this video is going to be devoid of any politics, and I'm just going to lay out the facts and let you make the determination on how you feel about everything. So, the New York Attorney General's office is suing Donald Trump, his children, and the organization he runs for fraud. Now, this civil action revolves around legal action initiated by the people of the state of New York, represented by Letitia James, the Attorney General of the state of New York, against Donald Trump Jr., Eric Trump, Alan Weisselberg, Jeffrey McQueen, and several of Trump's businesses. Now, the Attorney General's office is looking into certain business practices that the defendants engaged in from 2011 to 2021. The Office of the Attorney General's office alleges that the Trump organization committed repeated and persistent fraud by preparing, certifying, and submitting to banks and insurance companies false and misleading financial statements. This was purportedly in violation of New York Executive Law 63, subsection 12. The Attorney General's office alleges that the Trump organization made false and misleading claims on financial statements, violated New York state penal law, inflated valuations of property owned by the Trump organization, and that the Trump organization intended to deceive banks and insurance agencies by making false statements on business records. So before we get started, we need to understand some terms. The first term we're going to understand is a statement of financial condition. This is a statement that shows a snapshot of a person's monetary situation at a specific instance in time. This shows things like how much they owe, how much money they have, how many houses they own, and other stuff worth value. And contrast that to what they owe, things like loans and debts. The difference between the two is called a person's net worth. So think about it as a quick summary of a person's financial health at a specific point in time. The higher your net worth, the more money you can borrow, and the lower interest rates you'll be charged. Now, it's important to understand the way properties are valued. In this particular context, it's by appraisers. The Trump organization used some of the world's best appraisers in its business practices. Cushman and Wakefield, the Oxford Group, Newark, Knight Frank are some of the names that you'll hear throughout the document. Next, we're going to talk about the discrepancies between what the Trump organization claimed were the values for different properties and what the appraisers certified they believed the values were. So now, you may have heard this a lot in the news, but the court has ruled that Trump and his businesses has committed fraud in the state of New York. And here are the facts that led them to that conclusion. Now, the court relied on differences between the statement of financial condition prepared by the Trump organization and the appraisal certified by third parties. So here are some of the discrepancies that the court pointed to between the statement of financial condition and third-party appraisals. Now, let's talk about Trump Tower and the Trump Triplex. Now, Donald Trump has an apartment in Trump Tower, and that apartment is about 11,000 square feet. But the Trump organization claimed that it was about 30,000 square feet in its statement of financial condition. So that's about a 200% discrepancy between what it actually was and what they claimed it was in their financial documents. Now, since properties in New York are based on square footage, this led to the property being overvalued by about $114 to $207 million. Now, the defendant's reason for the discrepancy in square footage is that they say the calculation for square footage is subjective and can vary by as much as triple the amount. So if you have a 2,000 foot square home, you could claim it was 6,000 square feet. It all depends on how you're looking at the property. Now, the judge rejected that argument, saying that measurements can vary between 10 and 20%, which is common, but not triple the amount of space. And that discrepancy would be considered fraud with someone who is in the business of real estate, because Donald Trump and the Trump organization are real estate developers. Now, the next property the court looked at was Seven Springs Estate. Now, this was first appraised by the Royal Bank of Pennsylvania in the year 2000 at $25 million. Then it was appraised at $30 million in 2006. Then the appraisal firm Cushman and Wakefield came in and appraised the property in 2014 at $30 million, and then in 2016 again at $56 million. Now, the Trump organization, in their statement of financial condition, reported the value of the property at $261 million in 2011 and $291 million in 2012 to 2014. Now, the judge found that even giving the benefit of the doubt that the property was worth $56 million, that still means the Trump organization inflated the value of that property by over 400%. Now, the judge ruled that in light of having the appraiser and using the higher value, the $56 million, value the property at $56 million, but yet on their statement of financial condition, overvalue the property at $291 million, this 400% increase was indicative of fraud. The judge then looked at Trump Park Avenue, where the valuation of unsold residential condominium units at Trump Plaza seemed to be overvalued by a huge amount. Now, the Oxford Group valued 12 rent-stabilized units at $750,000 in 2010. Now, that's because the rental value was capped by New York state law. You could only rent those properties at a particular rate. Now, the reason for this is because you get a tax deduction for apartments that are rent stabilized, but you don't get that same tax deduction for apartments that are not rent stabilized. Now, in that building, there were 6 other units that were not rent stabilized, and the Newark Knight Frank Company evaluated those units at $22.8 million in 2020 because obviously they weren't under the same restrictions as the rent stabilized units, and since they weren't capped by law, skies were the limit or how much you can sell these units for. Now, in the Trump Organization's statement of financial condition, they inflated the value of the 12 rent stabilized units by 700%. And their reasoning was that the units could potentially be converted into units that were not capped by law. So because they could be valued at this higher amount, even though they're not valued at this higher amount now, they should be appraised at the higher amount. Now, the judge found that the statement of financial condition is a document that states the current value of objects, not future values. And the units were falsely inflated because they were only worth the lower amount now, and maybe 20 years in the future, they could be worth more, but they're not worth that now. So next, the court turned its attention to 40 Wall Street and the difference between the appraised value and the values listed on the statement of financial condition. For instance, the appraisal firm Cashman & Wakefield appraised the property at $200 million in 2011. But the Trump Organization, in its statement of financial condition, valued the property during that year at $524 million. The same thing happened in 2012, where the appraisal firm valued it at $220 million, while the Trump Organization, in the statement of financial condition, valued it at $527 million. And then lastly, in 2015, the appraisers valued the property at $540 million, while the Trump Organization valued it at $735 million. Now, the defendant's reasoning for the overvaluations were that they were immaterial because the lender who loaned money to the property based on those values were paid back in full and made money off the deal. But the judge said that the only requirement for liability here is that there were false statements on the statement of financial condition, and those statements were misleading and were used to conduct business. Now, the court then turned to Mar-a-Lago. Now, the deeds to the property at Mar-a-Lago only allowed it to be used as a social club. That limited its value tremendously. Now, the property was taxed at this lower value because you couldn't use it as a home, you could only use it as a social club. So the good people in Palm Beach County appraised the value of Mar-a-Lago at $18 million and as much as $27 million. Now, this was specifically because of that restriction. You couldn't use it as a home. Now, the Trump Organization, in its statement of financial condition, valued the property at $400 million, as high as $600 million. Now, their reasoning is that they, at one point in the future, would be able to breach their obligations under the contract they have with the state and convert the property to a home. Now, the judge in New York didn't buy this argument. The judge essentially said that the legal agreements in place at the time of evaluation must be used to obtain the true value of the property at that moment. Using the legal agreement that binds a property to benefit you with lower taxes, as they were doing in Florida, then on the backside, you would ignore the agreement to inflate the value to get a loan. That was quintessential fraud. Now, the judge ultimately ruled that because of the documentary evidence that showed the extreme differences between the certified appraisal's values and the Trump Organization's values over multiple years, this could only be fraud. Acceptable differences in values could range in the values of 10 to 20%, but these discrepancies were as much as 2,000% in some cases. The judge ruled that this was clearly fraud that benefited the defendant. Now, what was the motive for all this? Well, the judge said the motive of fraud was to benefit the Trump Organization financially and strategically in its business dealings. The ruling suggests that Donald Trump and his company lied to the government, banks, and insurers by both overvaluing some property and undervaluing assets when it was advantageous for them. For instance, by exaggerating their net worth and certain value of assets, Trump and the Trump Organization was able to secure favorable loan terms and lower insurance premiums, making both the bank and insurance companies the victims of the fraud. And on the opposite end, by lowering the value of some properties, they would have to pay lower taxes, for instance, like what happened in Palm Beach, Florida. Now, there are some facts that you do need to know. First, no bank ever complained about any of the loans. And another fact is all the loans were paid back in full. Another fact is that no insurance company ever complained about the rates that it charged or filed any complaints or actions with the Attorney General's office. Also, I think it's important to note that defendants argue that Trump being president also inflated the values of these properties. For example, Mar-a-Lago is listed for sale at $100 million now, but it's only being appraised at $27.6 million. And as you can see from this article, most real estate agents in that market would actually list the property for $300 million, even with the current restrictions in place. So why are we in court? Well, since the court found that Trump is actually liable for fraud, now the second part of the trial begins. Think about it this way. When you're in a criminal trial, first the jury finds you guilty or not guilty. If the jury finds you guilty, then the court sentences you to a prison term. That's essentially what we're doing here in the civil trial. This is essentially a sentencing hearing. Now the court's going to determine how much money, if any, the Trump Organization will have to pay and what penalties they'll owe to the state.
Important developments inside Donald Trump's civil fraud trial. The judge just made clear what can and cannot be discussed and what has already been determined. Namely, this judge made clear that he's already ruled that Trump committed fraud, and he's sort of done listening to arguments about that.
Now, what are the possible outcomes? Well, if Trump loses this trial, he could have to pay up to $250 million in cash to the government, and that would mean he'd have to sell off a lot of his prized possessions like Trump Tower and Mar-a-Lago. He will also not be allowed to conduct business in New York ever again, and neither will his children. It's also important that there are no victims complaining about being defrauded. Everyone was paid back. This is the state coming after Trump because of paperwork and the evaluations being exaggerated. And there are also some other concerns about the New York Attorney General, who essentially ran on a platform that I will get Trump. This is what she said in 2018 when she was running for Attorney General in a video titled Why Letitia James Wants to Take on Trump as New York Attorney General.
At a time when Congress, particularly Republicans, do not have a backbone, it's important that Democrats put some steel in their backbone and fight back. I believe that this president is incompetent. I believe that this president is ill-equipped to serve in the highest office of this land. And I believe that he is an embarrassment to all that we stand for. He should be charged with obstructing justice. I believe that the president of these United States can be indicted for criminal offenses. And we would join with law enforcement and other attorneys general across this nation in removing this president from office. In addition to that, the office of Attorney General will continue to follow the money because we believe that he's engaged in a pattern and practice of money laundering the money from foreign governments here in New York State, and particularly related to his real estate holdings. It's important that everyone understand that the days of Donald Trump are coming to an end, but we can only do it if all of you exercise the most fundamental right, a right which is basic to democracy, and that is the right to vote.
So a vote for Letitia James is a vote to get Trump. So no matter what you think about the evidence, you should be concerned about politicians campaigning on investigating their political opponents. But that's not the world we live in. You now have the facts. What to do with them is your choice. My name is Nate the Lawyer. If you like this video, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, do all that great YouTube stuff, and I'm going to see you later. Peace.